Hey, what's up, mortals? It is Agent Xerxes here, and before we get into the video, there's a few things I'd like to say. A quick thank you to our supporters on Patreon. The full list will be at the end of the video. If you'd like to support us and our content, please go over there and check it out. If you have a what if idea, and you want it done by us ASAP, you can now commission it from us. Go into the Discord that is in the description of this video, and DM the head writer. Tell him your idea, and he will explain the process to you. Now with that, it all began for Deku with a fire. Not a big forest fire or a large explosion in a city. No, this fire was his own doing. He awakened to a fire quirk. He was so excited to finally have a quirk that he set his house on fire, and his excitement slowly turned to fear. As his mother tried to escape the house with him, but it was too late. Beams were falling everywhere. The fire was getting hotter and hotter. But no matter what, she protected him, knowing there was no place to run. She embraced Deku and waited for the end to come. Eventually, a small group of local heroes showed up and retrieved Deku and his mother, only to find out that only Deku survived. 1 week passed until Deku woke up. Deku wakes up to find a small group of heroes in the hospital room. Gran Torino, All Might, Endeavour, Recovery Girl, Eraserhead, the Chief of Police, and UA High's Principal Nezu.
Ah, good, you're awake. Ah, young man, are you alright? Tell us what happened.
Where am I? Where's my mom? Perhaps the child needs time to breathe. He has been through quite the ordeal.
That is irrational. We need to know if this was a villain attack or not.
Aizawa! Not in front of the child. He's clearly already frightened.
Fine.
Where's my mom?
Can't you see the boy's been through enough? He wants answers as much as us. I'm sorry.
Deku goes fanboy for a moment.
Hey, I know you. You're the #2 hero. With more rescues than even All Might. Your quirk is called Hellflame. I think it's an emitter type quirk. It gives you like a pyrokinetic ability, so you can create and control fire in a vast of different ways. It's how you've managed to save so many people because of your ingenuity with a quirk that is mostly expected to destroy things. You're amazing!
Endeavour smiles, then frowns.
I'm sorry to tell you this, but we think your mother has died. We found a body at the fire site protecting you, but the body was beyond recognition. Tell us who was at that house with you when the fire started.
Deku shakes his head in disbelief.
No, it's impossible. Mom can't be dead.
Your mom. So what was her name?
Inko Midoriya.
Endeavour looks horrified.
Enji, what's wrong? Does that name mean something to you?
Endeavour takes a deep breath, then shakes his head.
No, it's nothing. So what is your name, young man?
I'm Izuku Midoriya. Kachan calls me Deku, though mostly to make fun of me.
Izuku, I am sorry we couldn't save your mom. But do you know of any family that can take care of you?
It's always been only me and my mom. I've never even met my dad.
Endeavour nods, knowing that was probably the case.
Okay, well then. Would you like to come live with me?
Deku looked up, shocked.
Why?
Well, it's either that, or that local orphanage, without any family to take you in.
Deku thinks for a moment, still processing the fact that his mom will never come back. He nods.
Okay. What are you thinking, Enji?
Agreed. We still need to question the boy.
Not what I meant. You already have children. Will you really be able to take care of another child?
Look, those children are different. I'm not going into it, but besides anything else this young boy has, no one he needs somebody, and unless any of you know anything about caring for a child, the responsibility is left up to me.
Everyone quietly mumbles under their breath in agreement.
As for you, Gran Torino, he's been through a lot. When he has settled into things, I will ask him about the incident.
Very well, that's reasonable enough, I suppose.
The chief of police speaks up for the first time.
But
Nezu raises his hand in silence to the chief. Endeavour is right. We must wait. We cannot expect a child to remember such a tragic event with accuracy if they are stressed or scared or under duress. We will wait.
Fine.
A few hours later, Deku had been released from the hospital and taken to Endeavor's mansion, where he was greeted by 4 children, 3 of which were less fierce-looking than the one of the same age as Deku. He had half red hair and half white hair, but on half his face, he had a burn scar.
This is your new family. From your left to your right, you have Fuyumi Toya, Natsuo, and Shoto. He is destined to take All Might's place. He will surpass even me.
Deku looks amazed. Wow! What's your quirk?
Half hot, half cold. He can use my powers and his mother's. He's going through a phase of rebellion right now, though.
Screw you. He turns away to go back inside.
Hey, disrespect me all you want, but don't treat Izuku like this. He just lost his mother to a fire.
All shocked, Deku, sad, starts crying.
Sorry. I didn't mean to.
It's my fault.
What do you mean?
I was so excited to get my quirk that I...
You have a quirk. Can I see it?
I don't want to kill anyone else.
Listen to me. I can take anything you can dish out. Show me. I'd like to see.
Deku nods and creates a fireball in his hand. See? I killed my mom. Endeavour kneels down.
It's not your fault. It was an accident. There are plenty of people who accidentally hurt people when their quirk activates. I'll train you to control your powers properly if you want.
Deku nods. Yes, please. Over the next few years, Deku and Shoto were trained by Endeavour. Deku was more thankful to the training. Deku happened to be the perfect training partner for Shoto. Endeavour had organized Deku's school to tell the students what had happened, and Katsuki was shocked. The shock was enough to force him to take a big look at himself. He's still confident, but now in this timeline, he's less of a pompous ass and more just confident in his abilities. A few years later, Deku and Todoroki are running to the exam site. Todoroki for the recommendation exams location, and Deku for the regular exams location. Good luck, brother. We've been training together for how many years? You should know I won't need any luck. But you better not lose either. Don't worry. I'll show you what I'm made of and come out on top. They both go their separate ways. Deku goes to the exam hall where President Mike explains the practical exam. How there are 4 robots to destroy, 1 pointers to 3 pointers, and then there's a useless to destroy robot, a 0 pointer. At the exam site, someone is there who Deku had completely forgotten about. Katsuki Bakugo, who is readying himself for the exam when he sees Deku. Okay, you can do this. You're strong. You're a badass. You're... Deku? Bakugo shakes his head when he sees Deku pass him. Bakugo goes to go after Deku, who hadn't even noticed him. What are you all doing? There are no timers in real battle. Go! 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 Everyone runs, including Deku, leaving Bakugo alone. What? Crap. I'll figure that out later. Right now I got an exam to pass. With Deku, he is not hesitating. Each robot he comes into contact with, he either melts, overheats, and blasts a fireball through their core power system, even saving some people, including a small boy that looked like he has grapes for hair, who was nearly crushed by falling debris. Thank you! No worries. Now get in there before there's no robots left. A boy with engine legs destroys a whole bunch of robots. A girl with gravity powers forces the robot to float into the sky, and she releases them, making them smash to the ground, destroying the robots. A light-haired boy who looks like he hasn't gotten sleep in years takes control of other people and forces them to destroy the robots himself, as well as pulling people out of the way of a robot's path. Eventually there was only 1 minute left. That's when the 0 pointer revealed itself, crashing through a giant building, making lots of debris fall. Almost everyone runs in the opposite direction. Deku was about to do the same thing when he heard a girl scream in pain. Ah, I'm stuck.
Somebody help, please. Deku turns around and sees Araka.
The girl with gravity powers stuck, unable to escape. He remembers what his father taught him.
To be a top hero, you can't lose. Always aim for the top, pushing other heroes to the ground. If you have to, it's a sad but a fact of life.
As Deku was about to ignore her, he also remembered the regret he's always felt about not being able to save his mom. No, this time I will save someone. Deku charges up an attack as powerful as he can, and shoots a fire blast at the robot's legs, making it fall to one knee. Deku then starts running up the building, using the fire to stick to the side of the building. Then he charges up another attack and shoots a fire blast at the Zero Pointer's head, destroying it. He lands back on the ground and helps Araka up, getting the bits of debris that had trapped her. That's time! If you haven't earned enough points, too bad! Better luck next year! Thank you. That was really brave. Well, saving people is part of being a hero too. I wouldn't be much of a hero in training if I abandoned you, would I? Araka smiles happily. I'm Ochaka Araka. What's your name? Izuku. Izuku Midoriya, but you can call me Deku. Bakugo shocked and horrified at what he had just seen. Deku? It really is you. Deku sees Bakugo, but doesn't recognize him. Do I know you? It's me, Katsuki Bakugo. You remember, you used to call me Kachan. Kachan? Kachan? Is it really you? Yeah. What happened to you? It's a long story, but Izuku. Deku turns around to see Shoto. Oh, hey bro! Dad wants to see us. Wonder what he wants this time. Right. Sorry, Kachan. We'll talk later. Yeah. See ya. Deku turns back to Araka. It was nice meeting you, Araka. Maybe we'll see each other around if we both make it into the hero course. Yeah, nice meeting you too. He was a bit odd. He's gotten a lot more tense. He used to be happy, I guess. He did lose his mom in that fire. Fire? Yeah. Should have been about 5 years ago. His mom died in a fire, only he survived. Guess now I know how, his quirk. Wait, his quirk! You don't think he did it, do you? Not intentionally. But he's always wanted a quirk, so maybe when it activated. Katsuki shakes his head. Doesn't matter. Who are you again? Ochaka Araka. Well, see you around, Araka. Back at the Todoroki mansion, NG Todoroki Endeavour is looking at them both fiercely. So... Shoto elbows Deku to shut up. Shoto may hate his father, but he knows when to shut up when he's in one of his moods.
So, how'd you both do?
Well, I passed every exam without fail. I'll need to wait for the written exam, but I know I got in. Enji nods happy. He then turns to Deku. Deku smiles. Well, you know me. I don't even need to wait. I passed the written exam, if not number 1, at least the top 10. As for the practical, let's just say I'm not worried.
Good. Very good. Now the reason I called you here. My sources tell me that a suspicious person is going to be attending UA with you. We think he's the child of a supervillain. We don't know who, though. Only that he's dangerous.
Isn't this top secret? Why are you telling us?
Because I want you two to use your connections as students to find whoever this villain child is and bring him to me. I will interrogate him and find out their master plan and stop it.
You seem worried. Is it really that bad?
I didn't want to worry you, but I believe that for the past 10 or so years, someone has been amassing followers and has built a league of villains, if you will. And if left to their own devices, could bring down the peace we heroes have worked so hard to uphold. Now do not fail me!
Both nod and walk away, knowing this was not going to be easy.
Young Midoriya tossed and turned that night. The boy was clearly unable to sleep. The possibility of a child of a high-profile villain at the very school he is attending made him restless. It ate at him at all hours of the night, causing him to sweat in his bed. A sense of dread balled up in his chest and throat, making it hard for him to breathe. This was the last thing he needed as he prepared himself for the next day of school. What didn't help matters was Toya's disappearance. The green-haired child thought of it and him every day. Where could he have gone? Did a villain get him? Were villains everywhere at this point?
To be a truly great hero, you can't fear villainous trash, Izuku. Fear is weakness, and villains know that.
It echoed throughout the boy's skull as if it were screamed in an empty cave, but how could it not be? The only sort of combat training he knew was when he sparred with Shoto, and during his very sparring training lessons with Enji. He had no experience in dealing with villains, potential or otherwise. Midoriya felt sick to his stomach, like at any moment he would throw up on his floor. The boy got up from his bed and made his way out to the front yard, hoping to catch some air. As he approaches the front porch, he spotted Shoto, sitting on the top step, hugging his knees. He was curled up into himself as if he were an animal defending his vital organs from predators. His hand was balled up and covered his mouth. Midoriya looked upon his adoptive brother. A pensive look plastered across his face. He wanted to comfort him, perhaps even have a heart-to-heart. He was unspoken amongst the entire family, but Midoriya knew Shoto was resentful of him. A stranger taken in by his father and given far better treatment than Shoto ever received in either of their lives. Midoriya watched him for a while through the doorway before shutting it and returning to his room. He lied in bed for the remainder of the night, staring up in his ceiling. It has been the least amount of sleep he's ever had since the death of his mother, Inko. The next morning, Midoriya and Shoto ate breakfast without Enji. He had left early, evidently. The breakfast was quiet. It was tense. Without Enji there to make any semblance of a conversation, the atmosphere was so thick it could be cut with a knife. After what seemed like an eternity to him, Midoriya finally spoke up.
So, a villain at our school, huh?
Midoriya asked, clearly trying to make a conversation. Son of a villain. Shoto's voice was as flat as ever. He didn't even look at the green-haired boy as he spoke. He clearly didn't want to have this conversation with Midoriya of all people for a number of reasons. Another wave of silence hit them.
Are you...
He paused, his face scrunched into one of discomfort.
Are you nervous at all?
Why would I be? Shoto asked. He finally looked up from his food to make eye contact with Midoriya. He was practically shooting daggers at the poor boy. I'm not weak. Midoriya knew what he was referring to. This was his cue to shut up, but the boy couldn't help but shoot back a glare of his own. After a moment of prolonged eye contact, Shoto looked back down at his food as he prepared to eat once more. You should worry about the villain, not yourself. Shoto flatly added before shoveling his breakfast into his mouth, intent on not saying anything else. Midoriya kept glaring at Shoto, his eyes feeling dry from not blinking.
Son of a villain?
He retorted, hissing through his teeth. With that, Midoriya picked up the rest of his food and carried it back into his room, though he had long since lost his appetite. His adoptive brother sneered as he exited the dining room. Time passed, and they had both walked to school. While physically they walked together, they were separate the entire time. Things were still sour between them from breakfast. The one moment Midoriya tries connecting with Shoto, he spits in his face. What gives? Midoriya had done nothing to the boy. As they approached 1A, Shoto shoved past him, speedwalking towards his seat. Clearly he didn't wish to be associated with the young man, especially considering what followed. As Midoriya had started to pass through the doorway, the classroom fell silent. Their faces had clear fear, disdain, or outright hatred. How pleasant. However, what was jarring to young Izuku was Bakugo. Even he was watching him with clear caution on his face. This was startling to Midoriya, as for the longest time, it was him who picked on the green-haired kid. After Bakugo realized Midoriya had noticed him and his apparent fear, the blonde quickly looked away from him. Unlike the other students, whose fear was more subdued by caution, Kaminari was more apparent. He darted towards his seat, which happened to be right behind Shoto. Kaminari leaned into his desk, making quiet noises to get Shoto's attention.
Bro, I heard they killed your mom. That's tough, man. I'm sorry.
Kaminari whispered. Shoto opened his mouth to say something, but decided against it. He figured that saying anything to this troglodyte would be a waste of time. Instead, he opted to pinch the bridge of his nose and release a sharp sigh. Kaminari placed a hand on Shoto's shoulder, completely misreading the situation. "Don't touch me." The red and white-haired boy hissed at the clueless blonde, causing him to quickly retract his hand. The only one to not outright react to him, or rather anything going on in the classroom, was this mysterious boy. His white hair reflected the fluorescent light emitted from the ceiling lights, and his face was of emotionless determination. Midoriya noticed him because this boy was the only student to not shoot him weird looks, or any sort of look for that matter. He didn't look at Midoriya, no matter how long he stared at him. Uraraka, however, was the more accepting of Midoriya's appearance. Unlike the rest, she figured it was merely speculation at best. Either way, he had saved her from the giant robot. Her face gleamed as she approached the schoolboy.
Hey, Deku!
Uraraka exclaimed, much to the rest of the class and Midoriya's shock. The boy, while not as awkward, was still surprised by the sudden interaction.
Oh, hey!
He hardly interacted with anyone outside of Enji. This was a first for him. After the two had started talking to each other, the class resumed chatter amongst themselves, albeit slowly and more cautiously. Midoriya and Uraraka spoke amongst themselves and talked about their first day of school. The plucky brunette took particular interest in the orientation and what friends she might make, much to their teacher's chagrin. It didn't help that he had been cocooned in a drab yellow sleeping bag behind them. After exiting the sleeping bag, the teacher introduced himself as Shota Aizawa. It was evident that he was a man who held punctuality and discipline above all else, even personal hygiene and a proper sleeping schedule apparently. Midoriya thought the name Aizawa sounded familiar somehow. He just couldn't place his finger on it. It tugged at the back of his mind like something he should remember, but for some reason couldn't. Their rather strict teacher, instead of letting them go to orientation like the rest of the school, had made them put on school-provided gym uniforms and brought them outside to the field to test their quirks. Anyone who ranked last faced immediate on-the-spot expulsion. The very prospect put the fear of God in the young schoolboys and girls, except for Shoto, Bakugo, and this white-haired mystery person. During the 50-meter dash, several of the students were using their quirks to the best of their ability in order to make it through point A to point B in record time. After Bakugo and Midoriya, Yaoyorozu and the white-haired student went up to the track, they readied themselves as they waited for the signature bang. As soon as they heard the minuscule explosion of gunpowder, the two students started sprinting forward. The white-haired student initially appeared to be only slightly faster than the other, more professionally inclined girl. Suddenly, in a similar fashion to Bakugo, the mystery student leaned forward and stretched his arms out towards his back. The air around his hands began to visibly distort, like his hands were creating an entirely new atmosphere around them. He suddenly leaped upward, the pressurized air rapid-firing from his palms, launching himself forward. This mystery student clocked in at 4.1 seconds. Bakugo grimaced and scowled at this sight. His teeth pressed together so hard, he could have shattered them through sheer force alone. This little nobody dared steal his technique and actually do slightly better than him? This made the wrathful blonde more furious than he had ever been in his life. "Hey bastard!" Bakugo sparked at the strange student. Bakugo promptly launched himself towards his newfound rival using a series of explosions. He hadn't even known his name, and he already felt the need to murder him. "Get your own damn technique!" Bakugo neared his opponent, his right arm pulled back to deliver a devastating right hook to the temple. The student held his hands in front of his face and put himself in a defensive position, ready to try and step aside the explosive aggressor. All Midoriya could do was watch in horror as his former bully prepared himself to brutalize the student. That was until Bakugo suddenly started to stagger out of the air. He had suddenly stopped producing fiery nitroglycerin blasts from his palms and began to fall from the air clumsily. At this height, he was sure to break something. That would be if Aizawa hadn't caught him out of the sky using his scarf. For a piece of cloth, it wrapped tightly around Bakugo, making sure he couldn't move. He began to writhe within the confines of the scarf, attempting to break himself free, to no avail. "I erased your quirk," Aizawa said. The tone of his voice, while flat as ever, was apparently seething. Clearly he had no patience for troublemakers like Bakugo. Using his scarf, he reeled in the rabid blonde like he were a fish he had just caught from the local pond. He turned Bakugo to his face. He made eye contact with the boy, to make sure his words would not be lost on the raging delinquent. "Last I checked, you don't have a patent on wantonly launching yourself through the air using your quirk. I shouldn't have to tell you that attacking a classmate because they did something similar to you
is extremely illogical. Not to mention not okay.
Aizawa then pulled on his scarf, quickly unraveling the boy and causing him to tumble. Needless to say, this only made the boy angrier. He started to feel a tight squeezing sensation on his skull as he kept thinking about this little no-name copying his technique, and the teacher actually siding against him.
Pull that again, and you're expelled, no matter what score you get here.
Coupled with Aizawa's clear obsession with logic, this was
Eraserhead,
Midoriya said to himself. Though normally his tone would be all kinds of giddy, he couldn't help but feel melancholic. He figured he had properly repressed that fateful night, that night where his quirk first activated. Aizawa looked at Midoriya ever so slightly. Truth was, the racer hero had recognized the young lad the very second he laid eyes on him. He felt for the boy, he really did, but he couldn't be open about that. The world of heroes and villains wouldn't care about the boy's strife, so he couldn't be open about his concern either. Bakugo's breathing started to get heavier and heavier. He turned towards Aizawa as if he had something to say, but he reminded himself of his lifelong passion, to be the #1 hero. So instead he bit his tongue and stood back up, dusting himself off. The white-haired student then approached the blonde, his expression neutral as ever.
If it's any consolation, Bakugo, I personally like the idea of launching yourself through the air using your quirk.
The students didn't know whether this kid was being genuine or not. His tone of voice, which somehow managed to be more expressionless than Aizawa's, didn't help matters. Bakugo stared at this boy with abject disgust. First he had the audacity to steal his technique, then he would dare be condescending to him? At least that's what Bakugo assumed. The visibly wrathful student snarled at this opposer and began walking away from him.
Piss off, freak!
The blonde growled at his new rival. As Bakugo started to walk away from the boy to stand over by the fence, Midoriya started to feel concerned for his troubled former bully. Midoriya stammered.
Are you okay, Kacha?
Shut the hell up, Deku!
For a moment, Bakugo was so angry he had completely forgotten about his apprehension towards the green-haired boy. It was actually refreshing to Midoriya for Bakugo to not be afraid of him like he was earlier, though he still didn't know why he was to begin with, let alone the rest of the class. The tests went on and Midoriya was doing surprisingly well. This was what he got for periodically training with the #2 hero and his adoptive father, Endeavour. While he wasn't as good as either Shoto or the mysterious student, or even Bakugo, he was at least racking up a decent score. It came time for the ball throwing contest. Bakugo had set a record of 701 meters when the trial first started. It would prove difficult for most of the class to even match that. Shoto, as expected from Midoriya, had done the best so far, barring Uraraka's score of infinity. Midoriya stepped up to the chalk circle in the dirt. He gripped the baseball tightly. He stretched his arm back and then swung overhead with all his strength. For good measure, he released a gust of fire from his palm shortly after. The hot air pushed the baseball further. Despite his fairly decent range, it still couldn't hold a candle to Shoto's.
How embarrassing,
Shoto remarked, disdain dripping from his words like viscous acid. Midoriya quickly turned towards his adoptive brother. An irate expression crawled across his face. Fire began to form in his hands before Aizawa spoke up again.
Need I remind the class that infighting will result in immediate expulsion?
Midoriya glared at the unpleasant boy he had called his brother. He filled his lungs with oxygen before letting the flames dissipate. This show of agitation caused the rest of the class to murmur amongst themselves. Even Uraraka looked concerned, though it appeared to be more for young Izuku's well-being. Midoriya scanned the class before returning to the crowd, a heavy expression across his face. Uraraka, being Izuku's only friend, approached him and put a comforting hand on his shoulder.
Are you okay?
Uraraka said, her voice reflecting her regard for Midoriya's welfare. Midoriya didn't even look at her, though he had given attention to her care.
Yeah.
Midoriya wavered, thinking about his words.
Yeah, I'll be fine.
Last was the white-haired student. His movements were graceful and delicate as he stepped up to the circle. It was almost like he wasn't touching the ground at all. Instead of the rest of the students who would throw their ball overhead, the lad simply held the ball at an upward angle. His classmates were understandably more than a little confused. But before their very eyes, the ball started to vibrate. It started slow, but it began to gradually become faster and faster, glowing red as it pulsated. He then let go of it, causing the ball to shoot forward at an impressive rate, especially for someone at his age. The class watched, awestruck, as the ball fired off like a red-hot bullet. This even caused Aizawa to ever so slightly flinch, though no one would have noticed unless they were paying very close attention to him. Slowly he turned to face Shoto. He eyed him intently before walking back into the crowd. Todoroki was clearly confused. He hadn't said one word to the guy. Bakugo being Bakugo believed that this look was directed at him instead. This only fueled his overt hatred for the fellow classmate. He watched him with a look of unabated rage, the capillaries in his eyes threatened to burst at any minute. After all the trials had been completed, the students gathered around Aizawa to receive their results. Midoriya's score was unremarkably average. He wasn't in danger of failing, but his score wasn't going to turn heads. This was especially in comparison to Shoto, Bakugo, and Deku? Who's that? That would be... Aizawa trailed, almost as if he had already forgotten who his own students were. Him. He then pointed over at the direction of the white-haired kid. Midoriya looked over at the expressionless classmate. He figured it was obvious in hindsight, especially due to his impressive physical exam scores. Midoriya looked back at the scoreboard. He noticed Zaiku and Shoto were almost neck and neck, with Zaiku being merely a couple of points off. Everyone was content with their placement, even Ayama, who was second to last. Everyone except the invisible girl that stood there, and while no one could see her face, they could tell she was devastated. No, no, Toru murmured. Her voice was wavery, like she was on the brink of tears. No, please, let me try again. I can get a better score, I promise. Aizawa gave her a cold stare. She knew the risk of failing the quirk apprehension test. To him, this gave her no right to beg for a redo. Sorry, kid. Rules are rules. Aizawa responded. Clearly he wasn't sorry. After all, she was the one who failed. Perhaps try to be a police officer or a doctor. Those are just as respectable a profession as being a hero. I'm afraid you're just not UA material, let alone hero material. Aizawa extended his arm forward, signalizing towards the exit of the field. You're free to leave now and pick up your stuff from my classroom, but you aren't to stay here by the end of the day. The invisible girl took a reflexive step back. She was taking in all the information she didn't want to hear, but she couldn't fight back against it. She slowly began to shuffle away from the crowd. Those that listened carefully heard sniffling sounds come from her direction as she vacated the area. As for everyone else, I expect you to be here tomorrow, Aizawa announced to the rest of the class. That concludes class for today. Aizawa began to walk away, the rest of the class shooting him grimaces. As of this point, he had established himself to be an undesirable and cruel teacher. At best, the rest of the students were relieved that it was finally over. As Aizawa made his way to the side of the school, he could feel a familiar presence looming over him.
A little cold, wouldn't you say, Aizawa?
The scruffy-looking hero turned to face the number one hero, All Might. He had his arms crossed, and despite his perpetual smile, seemed a bit perturbed by Eraser Hero's method of teaching. It'd be illogical of me to let her down easy. She had the worst score of anyone in the class. Even the belly button laser kid did better. Aizawa tonelessly stated,
But she's just a kid.
All Might remarked, his voice reflecting his disappointment in his fellow hero's lack of tact. Exactly, you may be fine with sending someone practically quirkless at hardened villains, but I'd rather not have that on my conscience. Aizawa countered. After that, he started to walk away from All Might. All Might, while annoyed with Aizawa's insistence on being logical, which at this point All Might figured was just Aizawa's excuse for being rude, couldn't help but think that he had a decent point in not letting her continue. He just wished his comrade would be more mindful that he is still working with youth. However, All Might didn't come to chew out Aizawa. As Aizawa left, the number one turned to face the class he had been watching at a distance. He took particular interest in the white-haired kid, though he reckoned it wasn't a good thing. There was just something eerily similar about the boy, but he couldn't place. It was a bright afternoon. Midoriya ate lunch with Uraraka, as she was the only person to actively eat with him. He noticed the only people eating alone were his brother Shoto and the mysterious student. Even Bakugo had some red-haired macho kid sitting with him, seemingly chatting up a one-sided storm with Bakugo, much to the angry blonde's dismay, of course. The sheer intensity his fellow classmate extruded was enough to intimidate the likes of Bakugo
and his adoptive brother. Midoriya remembered the scores of that test. The student and his brother were neck and neck almost exactly. The adoptive siblings didn't talk about it, but they were both certain this mysterious student was holding back. Just enough to not get noticed by their infamously strict teacher. The green-haired boy remembered his name to be Zaiku. As time passed, Uraraka and Midoriya walked to their classroom. They had talked to each other as they prepared for hero basic training. They had no idea who their next teacher could be, though they had hoped not every teacher was a soulless man like Aizawa was. I am here.
It was All Might. His presence overpowering even the likes of Bakugo's delinquency or Zaiku's sheer imposing disposition. The students were overjoyed to see the symbol of peace in their classroom. Especially Midoriya, even though he spent most of his life raised by the number one's hero's arch rival, Endeavour. For as long as Midoriya could remember, he had idolized this man. When his mother was alive, they would both watch the one video clip Inko had downloaded on the family computer. It was of All Might saving hundreds of people from a burning building. It was the very clip that made Midoriya want to be a hero. Everyone was chatting amongst themselves about the arrival of the number one hero and the symbol of peace, All Might. Even Bakugo seemed somewhat surprised by the towering man's presence. The two who didn't seem to emote were predictably to Midoriya, Shoto, and Zaiku. Midoriya understood why Shoto seemed indifferent towards All Might. He was raised to want to surpass him. Though no one knew why Zaiku didn't concern himself with All Might. All Might had told them all what hero basic training entailed, combat training. Bakugo was most pleased with this revelation. Even with his newfound concern about Midoriya, his love of fighting remained true. Even as a kid, the blonde delinquent loved to get into fights amongst his peers, solely to show them what true power was. All Might had revealed to them the students' costumes as the racks came out of the walls. Each of them had their costumes in each slot. The students were excited. It was the first day of school and they already got their own costumes, or in Bakugo's case, fight each other. A couple of minutes had passed as the students made their way to the training area in their costumes. Midoriya, despite having idolized All Might basically since conception, had his costume made to look like his adoptive father's costume, sans the flames that usually engulf it.
Kiss ass.
Shoto thought to himself as he saw Midoriya's costume. He figured that he would keep it to himself for the time being, as for some reason Zaiku had some issue with Shoto being cold towards his younger brother. All Might presented them with the simple rules of the tournament. Either the heroes must capture all the villains, or secure the bomb, or the villains must capture all the heroes, or survive until the allotted time had been up. Midoriya and Uraraka were on Team A. Uraraka was openly ecstatic to be working with Midoriya, while the emerald-haired boy tried to be on a cooler persona, though he was just as ecstatic to be working with the plucky brunette. He had already taken quite a fancy towards the girl, due to her being the first person thus far to even care to talk to him. Shoto and Soji were on Team B. Soji didn't exactly want to work with the red and white-haired kid, mainly on the grounds that he seemed particularly unpleasant toward his seemingly unhinged adoptive brother. At least that's what the narrative evolved to. The rumor that had been accidentally spread by the blonde turned from freak accident to manslaughter at best. Nonetheless, Soji decided he would remain professional with his new teammate. Team C was Yaoyorozu and Zaiku. As usual, Zaiku had exerted the same unreadable intensity he had since the minute school started. Team D was Bakugo and Ida. Bakugo was pumped up. This was his time to bust some heads and get rewarded for it. All Might had drawn the teams to face each other. The first matchup was Team A versus Team D. Ida looked overly concerned. He leaned over towards Bakugo and in a not-so-quiet whisper asked him,
Bakugo, is that not the person you said?
Ida paused, clearing his thoughts, and preparing himself for what he was about to say.
Killed his mom?
Bakugo's crazed smile withered into an annoying scowl. As he turned to tell his compatriot to silence himself, he noticed Midoriya glared at the blonde.
Midoriya had heard Ida, thanks to mainly to the nerdy kid's loudmouth. Once again, the blonde delinquent was the root of Midoriya's strife. For the first time in his life, Midoriya's blood began to boil as he thought of all the torment this person put him through as a child. Could he not escape this torture for once in his life? Midoriya's face was one of tame, intense hatred. His eyes were piercing the blonde. This did not go unnoticed by Uraraka or Ida, as they both grew fearful for Bakugo. The teams had begun setting themselves up after All Might had made the announcement. As Midoriya and Uraraka approached the door, Uraraka turned towards the green-haired boy. He was still visibly seething. While she didn't know what it was like, she could understand why he was livid.
Deku?
Uraraka spoke up, her voice gentle enough to try and reach Midoriya, without feeding into his apparent anger.
Are you okay?
Young Midoriya took a while to answer his brown-haired companion. At the moment, he was boring a hole into the metal door, simply by staring it down.
I'll be fine.
Midoriya said, his tone as flat as the people he had grown to know as generally unpleasant.
I have a score to settle though.
Meanwhile, Bakugo and Ida discussed their strategy for keeping Midoriya and Uraraka away. Especially Midoriya, as both of them had noticed Midoriya's wrath towards the blonde boy.
We should both stay here. That way, when they show up, we can both take them on.
Ida suggested.
I doubt they can match our combined speed and destructive power.
Bakugo thought it over. He was analyzing plans of his very own. Beneath his brutish exterior was a cunning warrior. After a while, Bakugo turned towards his glasses toning ally.
No!
Bakugo growled. The tone of his voice was enough to make Ida flinch for a second.
I have a better idea.
Midoriya and Uraraka scoured the complex, searching for any villains or the entrance to the room with the bomb. Midoriya in particular was looking for Bakugo. As they trudged through the halls, Midoriya replayed all the times the delinquent had pushed him around and had made his life hell. The welling rage caused him to pick up the pace, walking slightly faster than his teammate. Midoriya was looking for a fight. For the first time in his life, he wanted Bakugo to pay for what he did. With Midoriya's pace, it didn't take long for them to reach the second floor.
Deku!
The familiar screech caught the boy's attention. Midoriya spun around to face his rival, his eyes affixed on the ashy yellow-haired thug's location.
Bakugo.
Midoriya hissed. Though the delinquent would never admit this, he was taken aback by Midoriya. Vicious tone aside, this was the first time Midoriya had referred him by his name, and not Kachan. This was Midoriya's tell that he meant business. Turning to his left, Bakugo began to flee by blasting himself away, just like he did during the quirk apprehension test. Midoriya's stoic glare deformed itself into an enraged, toothy grin, something he subconsciously picked up from his current nemesis.
Uraraka, find the bomb!
The green-haired boy spat through his teeth.
I'll handle the fleeing villain!
No, Izuku, he's already gone. Let's just find the bomb.
Her words fell on deaf ears as Midoriya started using his fire quirk to propel himself forward, the hot air pushing him off the ground. Midoriya followed the sounds of explosions, leading him towards his enemy. It didn't take Midoriya long to catch up with Katsuki. Luckily, that's exactly what the delinquent wanted. In the heat of the moment, Midoriya stopped using his fire to propel him, instead wanting to land a flying kick on his former bully. As the formerly meek boy flew towards Bakugo, the atomic blonde slid out from under Midoriya. Raising his right arm, he pulled back the chrome handle on his gauntlet, revealing a pin under it. Pulling it out, the gauntlet released a stream of conflagration. A concentrated explosion made its way towards Midoriya. The boy had to propel himself using his fire once more. Pushing himself to an upright position, Bakugo's blast only forced Midoriya forward, hitting the glass window. If he had gone any faster, he would have surely been knocked out of the building. Picking himself up, his face went back to an expression of contained anger, rather than the feral rage he had exhibited beforehand.
You made my childhood hell, Bakugo! Was that not enough for you? You had to ruin my entire school here too?
Midoriya snarled at his former tormentor.
Will I never be rid of you?
Deep down, Bakugo knew this to be true. Within a single day, Bakugo had managed to throttle any chance of the angry green-haired boy having an easy first year in high school. But now wasn't the time for apologies. He had to pass this exam. He wouldn't go into the first day of school already having failed something. A cocky grin began stretching across the ashy yellow-haired boy's face. He reached his arms to his side as if beckoning Midoriya to attack him. With a scoff, Bakugo spoke. "You're the one to talk, late bloomer!" Bakugo snarled. "I couldn't get you away from him for years. I should be the one asking you if I'll never be rid of you." It was obvious to everyone, even Midoriya, that Bakugo was simply egging him on. But Midoriya was furious that his former bully wouldn't even acknowledge his original point. The boy looked even more determined to firmly plant Bakugo into the ground. Once again, Midoriya launched himself upward with his flames. Bakugo sneered at this pathetic display. "Always were the uncreated one, huh, Deku?" As Bakugo began to slide from out under Midoriya again, the green-haired boy smirked. He had successfully fallen right into his trap. Suddenly, Midoriya stopped propelling himself forward just before Bakugo was under him, instead pointing his hands downward at the delinquent. Bakugo's eyes widened as he realized what Midoriya was doing. The streams of fire from his hands grew more intense and increased in radius. In a matter of seconds, everything under Midoriya was bathed in fire. This startled everyone that was watching greatly, especially All Might. This show of violence clearly didn't help Midoriya's case among his classmates. In an instant, All Might grabbed the microphone to try to communicate with Bakugo. "Bakugo, come in, Bakugo!" Luckily, since Bakugo was already in motion, he wasn't smothered in the flames Midoriya tried to douse him in. That wasn't to say, however, that Bakugo was unscathed. Covered in first to second degree burns, Bakugo struggled to get up, but due to sheer will and determination, he managed to be upright. Bakugo placed a finger on his earpiece in response to All Might's worried cries. "Shut your trap, old man! I'm fine!" The blonde student barked at the hero. The concrete beneath them was blackened and emitting smoke. The gray rough floor began to crackle. The two brawling youths realized any more damage done to the floor using their quirks would cause it to give away. Instead, they had begun to inch towards each other. Their costumes sizzled at the touch of the burnt pavement. Their forearms blocked the sides of their face as they both began to crouch, protecting their stomachs. They intended to finish this the way men of old used to, through a bout of fisticuffs. Bakugo, making the first move, swung a right hook at the side of Midoriya's head. The emerald-haired boy ducked and bobbed under it, reciprocating with an elbow to the left side of Bakugo's cranium. The yellow-haired kid stumbled, leaning against the wall parallel to him. The shrimpy child he once knew had definitely gotten stronger, and it showed. The idea that his strength was getting challenged infuriated the arrogant youth. Using the hand that was against the wall, he pushed himself forward to gain momentum. Bakugo swung overhead using his left arm. Midoriya smirked. It was clear his arch-rival was getting desperate if he was going to use an attack like that. The green-haired boy rose his left arm, blocking Bakugo's pathetic attempt at getting a hit in. He then moved in to deliver a right jab to his former bully's chest. The delinquent smiled widely to himself. This was exactly what he wanted, and Midoriya had given it to him in full. Using his quick thinking, Bakugo grabbed the boy's right arm to halt his jab, and, utilizing the momentum of Midoriya's jab, pulled the green-haired child closer to him, raising his knee so that Midoriya's sternum would collide with it. The force of the knee to his chest was enough to daze the boy. His vision blurred, and his body went limp for a second. This was enough time for Bakugo to swing Midoriya into the wall behind the blonde, using the right arm he had grabbed. The boy barely had enough time to put his free hand behind his head to try and cushion the impact of his head slamming into the gray wall. The blow rattled his hand, though the pain was enough to jolt him out of his dazed state. With no other clear option, Midoriya lunged his head forward, smacking it into Bakugo's face. Blood pooled from the blonde's nose as he reeled back in pain, letting go of his current enemy's arm. Meanwhile, Uraraka had found the room with the bomb in it. She had noticed Ida was monologuing to no one in particular in something of a Saturday morning cartoon villain voice. This was truly a sight to behold, to Uraraka at least. Unable to contain her amusement, she barely stifled a laugh through her helmet. As he turned towards her in a classic supervillain fashion, flicking his arm upward as if he were brandishing some sort of cape. "Hark! Who goes there?" Ida called out. This was far too much for the perky brunette. She figured the jig was up, and albeit hesitantly revealed herself to the campy villain, that was Ida, as Ida monologued about his knowledge on Uraraka's quirk and how he cleared out the room of anything the girl could use against him. Uraraka pressed onto her earphone to communicate with Midoriya. Bakugo and Midoriya continued to brawl, fists flying at the other like they were bullets. The two appeared to be evenly matched until the green-haired boy received a message from his teammate.
Hey Deku, are you done with your fight with Bakugo? Ida spotted me, I'm sorry. His
Uraraka paused as if she was trying to read the situation.
monologuing at me right now. He's not trying to apprehend me right now, so you should have some time. I'm on the 3rd floor of the building.
The test. Somehow the boy had completely forgotten he was in a test. Suddenly, without thinking, Midori spun around to try and run towards the 3rd floor. This was Bakugo's chance. Leaping backward, he pointed his gauntlet at the smoldering concrete below Midoriya. Pulling the pin, he sent a stream of explosions at the floor beneath them. Because it didn't contain the maximum amount of his nitroglycerin-like sweat, it wasn't too strong, but it still produced exactly what he needed. It was all over now. In one fell swoop, Midoriya was buried beneath a pile of rubble.
All went dark for Midoriya. The last thing he remembered was trying to run to Uraraka's aid before the floor beneath him crumbled. As the concrete caved in, the boy was buried beneath piles of rubble. Did Uraraka manage to win out? Did she fail too? All he knew was Shoto was probably laughing about this, if only internally. He was aware that his adoptive brother never wore his emotions on his sleeves if it wasn't contempt. Midoriya woke up in a room he had never seen before. He was lying on a hospital bed, but he very much knew he wasn't at a hospital. As he gathered his bearings, he inspected himself to see what the extent of the damage was. Surprisingly, despite the soreness, he didn't look too beaten up. In fact, if he didn't know any better, he'd think he was simply dreaming that he failed the test. This must be the nurse's office, the boy thought to himself. He tried to sit up, but any time he did, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his cranium. It didn't take long for him to re-sign and lay back down on the bed. A couple of seconds later, he heard the bell on the door jingle. Someone had come in, evidenced by the footsteps approaching his bed. He turned to his side to see a short, old woman wearing medical clothing over her hero's uniform. "You're awake! How about that?" the elder woman exclaimed. She made her way to the side of the bed. "You've been out cold for a while now, young man." Midoriya recognized her much quicker than he did with Aizawa. He gave her a smile, though it was a mirthless smirk. Pain aside, the sight of all these heroes, even All Might, made him reflect back on the night of Inko's death, though he'd figured it'd be rude to take that out on them. "Hello, recovery girl," Midoriya responded. His voice was quiet and soft, due to being exhausted. Recovery girl's quirk really did a number on what was left on his stamina. Midoriya stammered, trying to find the words to ask the school nurse. "Did we pass? My friend, do you think we passed?" He had no idea why he still held out hope for that. Maybe it was because he felt that she didn't deserve to be dragged down with him. The elder hero turned towards him with a strained face. Midoriya already knew it wasn't good, though he listened to what she had to say. "Sorry, kid. Time ran out shortly after you got yourself buried." Midoriya held his forehead. He was deeply ashamed of himself for this. Not only did his anger towards his lifelong rival cost him the test, but he also dragged his teammate down with him too. A part of the test was to act like a hero, not just to capture the bad guys. And at that moment, the green-haired boy hadn't acted very heroic. With a sigh, Midoriya sunk further back into his pillow. He reflected on his own self-dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, the test had continued in the green-haired boy's absence. Everyone had gone and done their test. Shoto, as expected, passed with flying colors after having frozen his opponents in place, so that he and his teammate could secure the bomb. The students were so caught up in their own tests, they had completely forgotten about Midoriya. For the most part, in regard to the tests, it was anyone's fight.
Everyone was surprisingly skilled enough to stand toe-to-toe with each other, relatively even, barring Shoto, of course. This was until it was time for Team G and Team C to go against each other. Kaminari and Jiro versus Yayurozu and Zaiku. Yayurozu had begun preparations by creating metal plates to barricade the doors with.
It shouldn't take long for Kaminari to arrive. I suggest we fortify ourselves in here to run out the timer,
Yayurozu said. Her teammate took a second to ponder this strategy. He cocked his head to the side before speaking up. You only mentioned Kaminari. What of his teammate? Zaiku queried.
Jiro? I doubt she'll join him. She didn't display any sort of special offensive capabilities during the quirk apprehension test.
That was all the information he needed. With a few brisk steps, Zaiku placed his hand on his opponent's shoulder, startling her with his speed. Then there's no need for us both to be here. Stand aside, and I can handle this. Zaiku's tone of voice increased in intensity, though not in volume. It took on a more assertive tone than his usual cold, disinterested inflection. While this authoritative voice had taken Yayurozu aback, she stepped forward to try and talk the taller student out of his apparent plan to attack.
Wait, we're supposed to stay here and defend the bomb,
Yayurozu protested. There are two ways we can win this. We can either hold up here, or I can go out there and take the fight to them. We won't win this through attrition. Zaiku paused, taking this moment to turn towards his teammate. But rather through a show of force. That cold phrase was enough to send chills through the spines of anyone who witnessed it, even All Mights. The number one hero felt a pit grow in his stomach as his feelings of uneasiness about his student only became more intense. Even the normally unflappable Shoto, who couldn't even be bothered to wear his emotions on his sleeves, reeled back after hearing this. The students began chatting amongst themselves, debating on who is scarier between Zaiku and Midoriya. The sheer vehemence emanating from his words was enough to make almost anyone submit. Seeing no other choice, Yayurozu stepped away from the door, allowing her partner to step through without another word. Meanwhile, marching down the hallway was the hyperactive, if not the slightly dim, Kaminari. His lips curled into a cocky smirk as electricity crackled across his right forearm. Clearly, he had thought that his test would be a lot easier than it would turn out to be. As he scoured the halls looking for the room with the bomb, he noticed the air pressure around him changed slightly. As if on instinct, Kaminari leapt to the side, as if he were trying to avoid something. Sure enough, a hole was placed in the wall behind the blonde kid, causing pieces of the debris to shoot out from the damaged cavity in the concrete barrier. Spinning around, Kaminari locked his eyes with his opponent, Zaiku. The pale student had his arm pointed at Kaminari. The yellow-haired boy scoffed, attempting to maintain some amount of self-confidence.
That's some gnarly quirk you got there,
Kaminari remarked.
Nearly took my head off with that.
Wasn't my intent. Zaiku retorted, his voice reflecting some amount of indifference. However, I am a villain, so don't be surprised if the next one does. Kaminari took a step back. Either this kid was committed to the act of being a villain, or he really did intend to grievously harm the blonde. Kaminari raised his hands, his arms sparking with electricity.
Look, I already know the secret behind your quirk,
Kaminari stated.
I basically already won, dude. You should just go, man.
Kaminari had hoped that this would somehow be enough to ward off his opponent. He had hoped that this would bide some sort of time, though even he knew these were lackluster attempts at intimidation. Lowering his right arm, Zaiku glowered at his adversary.
Then perhaps I should change it up a bit.
Pointing his hands towards the ground, he shot electricity through the floor. In any other case, that would have been a sure hit. Zaiku, however, jumped upward. While this would normally be a futile attempt at avoiding getting hit, the white-haired boy didn't seem to come back down. As if he were personally insulting the notion of gravity itself, he remained in the air, standing on it as if it were a solid surface. This sight was enough to distract and stun the blonde. As far as everyone else was aware, he could only shoot pressurized air pockets from his hands. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, Kaminari spoke up.
What the hell? How are you?
Kaminari trailed off. His electricity started to fizzle out as he started to dribble over himself. He held his lightning for too long, and as such, his brain was starting to feel the adverse effects. In a matter of seconds, Zaiku was looming over the now helpless Kaminari. Pointing his arm at him once more, the air around his hand began to visibly distort. It began to click in All Might's head why this boy seemed so familiar. But before he could fully register what this all meant, a loud blast emitted from the speakers, and the screens went to static. Everyone was frozen in their tracks, unsure what to do. Slowly, All Might leaned in close to the microphone. His breaths were haggard and uneven. Kamadari? All Might murmured out. All that responded was the low drone of TV static. The only thing that scared these students as much as the prospect of their peer getting seriously injured, or worse, even, was the fact that their symbol of peace was shaken this much. Noticing his obvious anxiety was startling the students, All Might tried to change his tone to something more assertive. Denki Kaminari, respond immediately! Once again, all that grazed their ears was static. After what felt like years of silence, All Might began sprinting out of the room. He headed towards the test area, not sure what to expect. For the first time in years, All Might had felt dread, and it felt like it was pooling into his stomach. However, when he arrived, all he was met with were two students, both of whom were dumbfounded with tape around their arms. That kid, Jiro muttered to herself. He's something else entirely. A wave of relief washed over All Might. Even looking at the building, there was no apparent damage outside of the hole in the wall. The rest of the students caught up with All Might, the same relief washing over them. Even Bakugo seemed to relax a little. As if on cue, Zaiku and Yairozu emerged from the building. The dark-haired girl looked annoyed, mainly at the fact that her making all that metal meant nothing at this point. What was the point of even making those steel plates if you were just going to go rogue and do your own thing? Yairozu rebuked. Perhaps you should have discussed with me before making them then. Zaiku responded with an uncharacteristically air of snark. So now you're all about teamwork? The proper girl retaliated, the annoyance in her voice being more apparent. Zaiku opened his mouth to say something else, but was cut off by All Might. Young Zaiku! All Might called out. Despite the perpetual smile, he was clearly annoyed. He marched over to Zaiku, intending to have a stern conversation with the boy. You do realize what you did was overboard, don't you? Zaiku, despite his normally icy look, was confused by this statement. He remained silent for the moment before responding to the towering hero. Might I inquire as to what I did that was overboard? Zaiku questioned. Duh! All Might stammered, the boy's visible obliviousness taking the pro aback. The air bullet you sent at Kaminari over there. He was already impaired. Zaiku was only more confused by this statement, his emotionless glare being replaced with a more quizzical look. You didn't see me use the air bullet to launch Kaminari towards me? Zaiku asked. I used a controlled blast to send him towards me. I wasn't aware if he was just playing dumb or... Zaiku trailed off as he looked towards Kaminari, who was still drooling over himself and muttering nonsense. No, I didn't catch that. Considering you blew out the cameras. All Might responded, his tone of voice still firm. Zaiku placed a finger on his chin as he had thought about what All Might was telling him. At that moment, it seemed to click with the boy. I see, Zaiku stated, bowing his head. I apologize if I caused any sort of worry. All Might wasn't expecting compliance from this boy. He couldn't detect any sort of malice in his voice, but he still couldn't read the boy. He didn't know what the boy was trying to convey for that matter, considering the flatness of Zaiku's voice. Well, just... All Might paused for a second. Just be more mindful next time. Zaiku raised his head, his eyes meeting with All Might's. He retained his poker face as his gaze met the number one hero's. I look forward to learning under you, All Might. With that, Zaiku walked away. Most of his peers assumed he had gone back to the classroom, as when they went back, his stuff was gone. Meanwhile, Midori had just left the nurse's office. His wounds still hurt like nothing he'd ever experienced, but he was grateful that he was in walking condition. As he started to walk home, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. Hey, Deku! Uraraka hollered, much to Midori's confusion. Midoriya turned to meet Uraraka, who was walking over to him with her usual cheery face. Uraraka? You're not... The green-haired boy stammered, both out of confusion and out of personal shame. You're not mad at me at all? Right after he asked, Uraraka delivered a mean slap upside his head, jolting Midoriya forward. I was, Dillweed! You cost us the test! Midoriya rubbed the back of his head as Uraraka sighed, collecting herself and her thoughts. But I understand why you were upset. So how about we call that even? The plucky brunette said, her tone softening to a friendlier tone. She flashed a smile at Midoriya, to which he reciprocated, though it was a more embarrassed smile. Yeah, Midoriya murmured, his tone reflecting his self-consciousness. Sorry. The next day, Midoriya and Uraraka walked to class together. Shoto had gone to school earlier to make use of the training field to be more effective with his quirk. However, when they went to class, they were met with something truly unexpected. "Hey guys!" Toru exclaimed. She sounded happy to be back. Everyone was confused, but mostly happy that she was back. She seemed distraught when she got expelled. Shortly after Midoriya and Uraraka got to class, their teacher, Aizawa, stepped in. "Right, everyone in your seats," Aizawa announced, his voice still a dull drone. "As you all can see, we have a returning student." "Yes, why is this? Did you not say that anyone who failed would be expelled?" Ida queried. Their irritable teacher sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I was gonna get to that before you interrupted," Aizawa responded. The schoolboy's face was flushed. He had just interrupted a teacher, one of the many school-related things he vowed to himself that he would never do. "Anyways, I hope you realize that I don't actually expel my students. I send them home so they can reflect and learn from their mistakes. In Toru Hagugara's case, she seemed to learn in record time." Aizawa stated, "Out there, it would be illogical of anyone to send someone with a useless quirk after hardened criminals. But..." Aizawa sighed, his lethargy beginning to get the better of him. "A quirk is only as useful as you let it be." The students began chatting amongst themselves again, though a lot of it was also praise directed at Aizawa. "I knew you were secretly a cool guy, Mr. Aizawa," Kirishima chortled. After a while, it became a discussion on who would be best suited for class representative. Ida suggested that they hold an election, to which he won by a thin margin. Midoriya was just happy to be involved. It seemed like the first time that he could just be a part of normal school activities. Meanwhile, however, there was someone watching their school intently. Behind the crowds of demanding news reporters, clamoring to just get one interview with the now teacher, All Might, was a man with unbridled hatred for the pro-hero. He wore a full black jumpsuit, exposing only his head and his hands. His face was tired and restless, with wrinkles and scars blemishing his face. He began scratching at his neck as he thought about All Might. "No matter what it takes, All Might," the man rasped, "I will get you." After the students had elected their class representative, Midoriya and Uraraka went to eat lunch. Everything went the same as normal, save for the reporters that had been glamoring outside of their wall earlier this morning. However, in the middle of lunch, the alarms had started to blare. Mass panic and hysteria had swept through the halls of the school as students clamored to evacuate. Scenarios ran through Izuku's head. Did that mole Endeavour inform him and Shoto about strikes sooner than anticipated? Was it an entirely different villain? Who was it? As the students attempted to shove their way out, Izuku looked towards the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the damage. Much to the boy's relief, he merely saw normal reporters scrambling to find the ever-elusive All Might. It made sense that they'd go to these lengths to try and talk to the number one hero, seeing as he had deliberately avoided such for some time. Swiping the sweat off his forehead, he relaxed, knowing it wasn't a serious threat, though he had realized that the rest of the students hadn't known this. "Hey, wait! Everyone! It's just reporters!" Izuku cried out, but because of the panic, no one had heard him. Izuku looked around, desperate to find anything or anyone to get their attention. Luckily, Izuku's gaze shifted towards the newly appointed class representative, Tenya Ida. He was just within arm's reach. Izuku could grab his attention. Swiftly, he moved in, tugging at Ida's sleeve like a child trying to get an adult's attention. The sudden jerking caused the already panicked prep student to whip his head towards the one tugging on his shirt. As if he couldn't get more panicked, he had noticed the one tugging on his shirt was the rumored to be unhinged student Izuku. Before the class rep could say anything, Izuku spoke over him, knowing if he didn't say anything soon, he could very well lose his one shot at quieting this hysteria. "I've seen your quirk. You need to find a way to get to the front of the crowd," Izuku said, his voice very clearly translating the urgency of his request. "What? Why?" Ida questioned, his tone of voice skeptical but still panicked. "Look!" Izuku pointed at the window they were both next to. The look on the young speedster's face went from hysterical and worried to a look of relieved realization. "It's just..." Ida paused, still taking in what he's observing. "Reporters?" Using his quick thinking, Ida looked forward, seeing the 3-inch thick ledge on the exit door. "I have an idea." Ida declared, his voice reflecting that of cool-headed determination. Wasting no more time, the otherwise responsible young man activated the thrusters on his shins, propelling himself towards the top of the exit. This spectacle of a man flying towards the ceiling was such a sight to behold that it caught the attention of all that witnessed it, stopping the crowd of frightened students in their tracks. "Everyone, remain calm," the glasses-wearing boy announced. "Everything is fine. A couple of reporters just made their way onto campus grounds." The students looked to their right as if to clarify Ida's statements. It was just as he said. A group of reporters had made their way onto UA grounds and were promptly getting escorted off the premises by the police and teachers. A wave of collective solace washed over the then terrified school children, realizing their worries were evidently for nothing. After Ida had successfully quelled the uproarious fear amongst his fellow students, it was time for their next class. During the student meeting, the students in 1A talked amongst each other about Ida's aptitude in handling mass panic amongst the student body, while also lavishing him with praise. While Ida was definitely flattered, this wasn't to say he didn't feel bad for Izuku. He was the one to direct the glasses-wearing boy to the lack of apparent danger, and that was noteworthy in Ida's book. In the midst of the students chattering, the student representative had spoken up. "While I appreciate your compliments, there is one person I couldn't have done this without," Ida stated. He had gestured over to Izuku, who was now equal parts confused and flustered. "Had it not been for his situational awareness, I probably would have continued to struggle to get outside. Due to this, I feel he deserved just as much, if not more recognition than I." The students had begun chattering amongst themselves once more, though this time it was more confused. Even Izuku was nonplussed. It seemed to the students that Ida was grasping at straws in an attempt to give his classmate a good name. After mere seconds of chatter, they decided if Ida could vouch for him, then there shouldn't be much to worry about. And though they didn't entirely trust him, they did toss more than a few kind gestures his way. For the first time in recent years, Izuku felt welcomed by his peers. "This is pointless," Aizawa flatly stated while sitting up from his sleeping bag, startling Ida. "If neither of you have got anything important to say, then take your seats." Meanwhile, as class went on for 1A, 4 pros went to investigate. Principal Nezu, Midnight 13, and Recovery Girl, what they had bore witness to shocked the tetrad of heroes to the core. Their main gate had been crumbled to mere dust. No one knew who did it, though they had speculated amongst themselves that it could be the work of a villain. Was it merely a display of power, or a declaration of war? As the Hero Basic Training course rolled around, the students had taken notice of Aizawa substituting for All Might. Apparently, the number 1 hero had more important matters to attend to. Matters that Aizawa clearly didn't care about explaining. Their lethargic teacher had said that the students would be brought to the unforeseen simulation joint and that they would be supervised by him, All Might, and another faculty member. The students were bewildered by the sheer amount of pros that would be showing up. They had all collectively wondered if this was due to the reporters breaking onto school grounds. Regardless, the school children were excited to finally be able to practice rescue work. The students had been able to wear their costumes outside of school, to which Izuku had decided to wear his costume, made in his adoptive father's likeness. Promptly, Class 1A was placed onto a bus and sent to the USJ. Ida had done most of the directing, making sure the class had boarded the vehicle in a neat and orderly manner.
"Hello, everybody. I've been waiting for you."
13 greeted. Her voice sounded like that of a tour guide. Judging by the expressions on the school children's faces, they were aware of the space hero 13, with Uraraka even stating that 13 was among her favorites. As 13 escorted the class of 1A inside the complex, the students had found themselves astonished and amazed at the sheer size of the complex. Somehow this one building had managed to contain mountainous biomes, a flaming city, a sizable body of water, and so much more. This was more than these children had ever seen. It was blowing their minds.
"I created this training facility to prepare you to deal with different types of disasters,"
13 announced.
"I call it the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, but you can call it USJ."
Feeling uneasy, Aizawa approached 13. The two of them had discussed All Might's apparent absence. Izuku could have sworn he heard her talk about how the number 1 hero used up all his power. What did she mean by this? Did he hear her wrong? He tried to shrug it off, as the rest of the students hadn't seemed to hear her. Shortly after Aizawa and 13 were done talking amongst themselves about All Might's non-attendance, the space hero redirected her attention back to the students to talk about her quirk, Black Hole. She had explained that while she had used her quirk for rescue thus far, it could also be used for killing as well. She used her own quirk's dangerousness to illustrate to the kids that keeping their own quirks in check had to be paramount in order to be a hero. As if on cue, right after 13 had stated the potential danger of using a quirk, whether it's to apprehend a villain or rescue a civilian, the lights had begun to blow out. The fountain sputtered and curdled until it had stopped spewing water entirely. Afterwards, a dark miasma had begun to form in front of the fountain, spewing out thugs and criminals left and right. Aizawa and 13 placed themselves in front of the students, intent on protecting them from whatever would try to stand before them. The students were confused. They thought this was merely a rescue exercise complex. However, upon watching Aizawa ready himself, they realized all too quickly that this was a real invasion. A wave of fear washed over the students. They had only begun training mere days ago. They clearly weren't prepared to fight actual villains head-on. 3 notable figures stepped outside of the dark plume. They didn't look like the rest of the 2-bit thugs that stepped outside of the cloud before them. One was a man dressed in all black. He had mummified hands covering his entire body, grasping at different limbs and parts of his head. Another appeared to be made out of the dark cloud entirely. It was a formless cloud with only yellow piercing eyes. The third being a hulky black figure. It had scars all over his body, a pair of silky yellow lips, and an exposed brain.
The real heroes, I see.
The sentient miasma reported, seemingly to the man covered in hands.
Eraserhead and 13.
As the delinquents and thugs marched towards the heroes and students, the thin, dark-clothed man grew evidently impatient.
I go through the trouble of bringing all my friends, and All Might isn't here.
The thin man rasped out. His voice sounded like that of a chain smoker.
Maybe if I kill a few kids, he'll come out and play.
The students were stunned. They wondered how they could get in without tripping the alarm. Even 13 was unsure about how they managed to go about this. However, Shoto, being the analytical boy he is, managed to deduce at least their means.
If the alarm sensors aren't being triggered, then one of these villains must have a quirk that's masking their presence here.
Shoto said,
They had to have a carefully chosen time to invade this facility when class was being taught.
Izuku added. The 2 adoptive siblings eyed each other. Neither of them liked affirming the other, but they simply didn't have the time to berate each other. Instead, however, they had given each other a sort of non-verbal attestation, which was the most affection they had ever given each other. Before long, young Todoroki pulled his attention away from his adoptive sibling.
They're fools to have come here, but they thought this out.
Aizawa had ordered 13 to evacuate the children and contact the school, to which Shoto remarked that if there's a villain with a quirk that can disrupt alarm sensors, then there should be one that disrupts communication as well. With no other choice, the normally lethargic teacher decided it was time to step into the fray, much to Izuku's bewilderment.
Wait, are you crazy?
Izuku asked, worried in tone.
Your fighting style isn't suited for big groups, just stealth operations and one-to-one takedowns.
Kid,
Aizawa said, turning his head towards his student.
You can't be a pro with one trick.
In an instant, Aizawa had launched himself towards a group of small-time thugs. A small group of ranged villains suffered dearly for not knowing who he was and got disposed of quickly. Thugs with mutant quirks attempted to charge their racer hero, though to no avail as he proved to be more than their match physically. The leader of their group had grown even more impatient. He watched as the Eraserhead had begun to thrash his underlings with minimal effort. It was irritating to watch for this villain. The head villain began scratching his neck, his nails digging deeper and deeper into his flesh until it started to abrase his skin. As the students tried to evacuate alongside 13, the sentient dark cloud had taken notice of the currently fleeing prey. In an instant, the miasma warped itself in front of the group of potential victims, attempting to escape the facility, stopping them in their tracks.
A pleasure to meet you,
the dark cloud stated, his polite voice having condescending overtones.
We are the League of Villains.
unthinkable had happened. Villains managed to infiltrate a secured location like the USJ, and a large group at that. As Aizawa was fighting off legion upon legion of criminals and various ne'er-do-wells, he had issued the space hero to escort the students in evacuating the facility. As the students tried to evacuate alongside 13, the sentient dark cloud had taken notice of the current fleeing prey. In an instant, the miasma warped itself in front of the group of potential victims, attempting to escape the facility, stopping them in their tracks. "A pleasure to meet you," the dark cloud stated, his polite voice having condescending overtones. "We are the League of Villains." As this cloud of sapient evil had spoken, the students that were its literal captive audience had been frozen in their tracks. Their nerves were screaming at them to run, each thought in their head telling them to scatter. But their muscles had been tightened to such a degree that it prevented them from acting on their most desired thoughts. "I know it's impolite, but we decided to let ourselves into this haven of justice, to say hello." Though the students couldn't see it, it was clear to them that this specter was flashing them the cruelest of smirks. "And besides, isn't this a fitting place for All Might, the symbol of peace, to take his last breath?" These children didn't know what to do. As the black fog was talking about All Might and his apparent absence, all these kids could do was look on in abject horror. They came to kill All Might. Normally a notion like this would be of no concern to anyone, as the blonde superhero was practically a god to the eyes of the public. However, coupled with these villains' surprising amount of intuitiveness and their tenacious cruelty, they couldn't help but wonder, can All Might be killed? As the shadowy figure moved to attack, 13 had tried to unleash her quirk, Black Hole. But before she could do anything, the two most reckless students, Bakugo and Kurishima, had launched themselves forward at the cloud. Due to their careless attitude, the apparition began to cover the class of children, swallowing them whole and warping them to various parts of the facility. The only ones spared were a handful of students, including Tenya Ida, Ochako Uraraka, and Rikiro Sato. This was thanks to the former's incredible speed. Midoriya was transported to the lake portion of the USJ. As he crashed into the water, he had been met with a half-hammerhead shark man swimming at him at full force. His jaws widened as he prepared to maim the green-haired boy, and Izuku couldn't react fast enough to stop this Tennyson of the deep. However, when all seemed lost, Tsuyu Asui had suddenly delivered a kick to the shark man's head. The force sent the watery thug careening away from the two.
"Hey, Midoriya!"
The frog girl greeted. Shortly after doing so, she grabbed onto her classmate using her long prehensile tongue. As if on cue, the white-haired student sent himself to the two at practically Mach speed. The velocity at which the boy had sent himself was enough to send both him and the two classmates onto the nearby boat.
"Thanks for the save, Asui. And,
Midoriya trailed off, trying to remember the ever-stoic classmate's name. He couldn't forget the boy's sheer presence, though he wasn't great with names. "Zaiku."
"Right, Zaiku,"
the dead-eyed schoolboy said in response. Midoriya replied, his awkwardness practically shining through his mouth with each syllable spoken.
"It's no problem at all.
Tsuyu uttered.
And please call me Sue."
Looking over the sides of the vessel, they noticed hordes of criminals circling around the triad of children like sharks that caught the scent of blood. They all flashed the children with malicious smiles, cold snares, and ravenous hunger. The only one of the trio who didn't look outwardly threatened by the wave of aquatic menaces was the icy Zaiku, though even he was at a pause. After a while of this constant toying around, the white-haired student displayed a glimmer of impatience. Extending a hand outward, pockets of air began to form within his palm. Shot after shot, each of their air bullets would narrowly miss their target, with the marine malefactors swimming out of the way with each air bullet that headed towards them. After about 5 shots, Zaiku lowered his arm. "Slippery bastards!" The normally taciturn boy growled.
"They aren't making an attempt to climb up the boat."
Midoriya thought out loud.
"It's obvious they have an advantage there in the water."
This caught the attention of both the frog girl and the quiet boy. They both noticed that as well. But it was apparent the green-haired student was trying to come up with a plan. Huddling together, they both decided to discuss their quirks amongst themselves. After Tsuyu had discussed her quirk, Midori was the second to volunteer information about his to the small group of 3.
I can shoot flames up to 20 meters and they get up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit.
Izuku stated,
I can shoot them for about 5 minutes, but if I do it for too long, I'll start to burn myself.
Zaiku took a moment. He looked as though he was thinking about what he should say. Before long, he opened his mouth to speak. I can create air bubbles within my palms, as you two could plainly see, but it takes a decent amount of time to form one, depending on the size, on average about 15 seconds each. The 3 took about another moment to create a cohesive plan amongst themselves. Though as they did so, one of the villains had gotten impatient and began forming a giant appendage created by hardened controlled water.
You're taking too long!
The watery ne'er-do-well shrieked, his voice reflecting his unhinged desire to do the children harm. Considering your flames can reach that temperature, I would direct your flames at the water they're in. Zaiku suggested to his green-haired compatriot, get it at least simmering temperature, boiling is ideal.
But won't that cause serious injury to them?
Izuku queried. He didn't enjoy harming things with his quirk, fellow humans most especially, even if his fiery temper got the better of him at times. The white-haired boy replied, if they're smart, their self-preservation instincts won't allow that. They'll swim out to the shore as soon as it gets too hot for their liking. As for me, I'll... That's when they heard the impatient cacophony screech of the villain. As the giant hand came crashing down on them, Zaiku had no time but to operate on instinct. Scooping up Tsuyu, who launched himself at incredible speeds, bursting through the watery arm. The initial launch was so strong it placed foot-shaped indents where he was standing to begin with.
I thought your quirk was air manipulation.
The amphibious lass remarked. Izuku, now! Zaiku called out to his impromptu partner. At a moment's notice, Deku had outstretched his hand outward, shooting a cone of fire directly at the criminals at the forefront of his line of sight. Predictably, the aquatic villains ducked underneath, banking on the water's glossy veil to shield them from Izuku's harsh plumes of flame. This was exactly what the Fury Boy banked on. After about 15 seconds, the water had begun to steam up. At first, the cocky villains believed all his flames would give them a nice hot spring bath as they prepared to rip the boy to shreds. However, before long, the water became uncomfortably hot, then painfully hot. Collectively, the villains decided it'd be best to save their own skin rather than foolishly attempt to flay Midoriya of his. The villains made a mad dash, or rather a mad swim towards the shore. However, as each one made it to land, they were each with an invisible punch to the face as Zaiku launched air bullets at the criminals. Some dislodged teeth, some broken noses, and some even dislocated jaws. But they all knocked them out cold. Izuku wasn't far behind, using his quirk's capability to lift him off the ground. He traversed 3 feet off the surface at all times to keep a low profile, so as to not get caught by the 3 most presumably dangerous people there. The green-haired boy briefly preoccupied himself by second-guessing his and his teammates' actions, to which Tsuyu promptly told him to cut it out. Using their free time, they decided to check on Aizawa and 13. The 2 appeared to have the upper hand with their respective villains. Aizawa with a pale, raspy man, and 13 with a cloud of nauseous evil. Aizawa was pummeling the pale man's cronies using his quirk-erasing quirk, and 13 was in the process of vacuuming up the specter that stood before her. However, as 13 was in the process of sucking in his horrifying shadow with her quirk, Black Hole, he took advantage of her lack of fighting experience. In that instant, the malignant haze opened up a warp gate in front of him, and one behind 13, causing her to rip out her own back. Luckily, some good had come from this situation, as Tenya, while the evil cloud was preoccupied with 13, managed to escape the facility, making a dash towards UA to alert the other pros with what was currently happening at the USJ. After making clean work of the other 2-bit thugs, Aizawa had moved onto the leader of their ragtag group of misfits. Not that he had a choice anyway, as the lanky cryptid of a man made a dash towards him. "Final boss," Aizawa said to himself. The pro made a dash towards the man as well. Swinging his hip to the right, the raggedy hero extended his elbow outward, aiming to deliver a devastating blow to the criminal's chest. However, the pasty villain barely caught the attack as it was buried into his ribcage. Though he was still touching the elbow and it was enough to activate his quirk. Slowly, as if to taunt Eraserhead, the clothes on his arm had begun to dissolve. Then the skin on his elbow had begun to crumble. The pro pulled his arm away in time, though the flesh on his right elbow had been stripped away, with only bare muscle showing. His right arm was rendered completely useless, though he could still take out the 2-bit thugs that were still trying to bum rush him. Then suddenly, without warning, the pitch-black mutant stood at Aizawa's side, firmly gripping the smaller man's shoulder. The pressure of the grip felt like it could completely amputate the pro's entire left arm, leaving nothing but a stump.
By the way,
The light blue-haired man said, his voice overtly mocking in tone.
I'm not the final boss.
As if on cue, the giant creature barreled its balled-up hand at Aizawa's face, shattering the top part of his face. Unfortunately for the pro and the students that watched, his pain would not cease there. The creature would continuously brutalize Eraserhead into submission, sickening crunch after sickening crunch until it had him pinned down. Standing over the downed hero, the villainous leader took his time to gloat. Though no one could see it, due to the mummified hand covering his face, it was clear to anyone witnessing that this creature of a human being was smiling wickedly at this sight. Save, perhaps, the brain-dead Frankenstein's monster that had Aizawa pinned. It wasn't All Might, that one's for sure. But the villain took extreme joy in watching this mutant violently dismantle the pro before his very eyes.
What do you think of him, Eraserhead?
The creep sardonically asked his victim.
His bioengineered anti-symbol of peace. But you can call him Nomu.
Tsuyu Zaiku watched on in horror as the beast began physically dismantling Aizawa. Each strike from the hulking figure sent thick, crimson liquid flying from the pro-hero, decorating the nearby surroundings with its dull glow. It was, in every meaning of the word, horrible. This abhorrent display of power being used to brutalize their teacher was a traumatizing sight to behold, to say the least.
What do you think of him, Eraserhead?
The creep sardonically asked his victim.
Is the bioengineered anti-symbol of peace. But you can call him Nomu.
Nomu. It was apparent to all who witnessed that the game has changed right from underneath their noses. Never before had anyone created an affront to nature such as this. Never before had a being like this tainted the land it stood on, quite like the mutant loomed above Eraserhead. Not in recent times at least. The monster shrieked in what most assumed to be triumph. Not because it had recognized that it harmed a pro-hero, but because it recognized that it had harmed someone. Its mind was consumed by an ever-present need for arbitrary violence. That much was clear to all who had the stomach to watch the creature. Its animalistic movements, its apparent all-consuming rage, there was no doubt about it. This thing, whatever it was a mindless engine of destruction. The Nomu had taken its time breaking Aizawa, toying with its victim like a cat torturing a mouse. Eraserhead turned as much as he could, trying to stare at the mutant to erase his quirk, though it proved to be a futile effort as it crushed the other arm without as much as batting an eye. It didn't even seem to realize that its other quirks were erased. The trio of unlikely companions watched on, shell-shocked as this mindless homunculus laid into their teacher. Zaiku's fear was the most palpable, as his normal stoic face crumbled into that of abject terror, was all the normally unflappable white-haired boy could muster out. His voice was a hushed whisper, though it echoed at the back of the triad of students' heads, ringing insistently. Suddenly, the evil cloud had materialized right next to the pale man. They had looked at each other. It was clear they were conversating amongst themselves, though it was hard for any of them to make out, primarily due to their distance, but also because they both had no discernible facial features, so reading their lips was impossible. However, whatever the malicious perspiration said evidently irritated the younger villain, as he had begun to scratch his neck, as he did before when he realized that All Might was absent. The hand covered ne'er-do-well's scratching became more relentless as he began scratching his neck with both of his hands. However, the scratching suddenly stopped. The posture of the young villain became less enraged and more disappointed, though they couldn't hear their conversation. For the most part, there was one thing the three students heard, clear as day.
There's no way we can win if dozens of heroes show up to stop us. It's game over. Back to the title screen.
The villain said, despondently.
It's game over. Back to the title screen. And I was looking forward to finishing this today. Damn it. Let's go home.
The three students' eyes lit up. A full retreat practically out of nowhere. It seemed too good to be true. Luckily, they treated it as much. After all, they kept one thing in mind. Their goal. They wanted to kill All Might. They clearly went through a lot of trouble to do so. They even bioengineered and hauled a 7'2" monster to do so. So what gives? Why retreat now?
Oh, before we go,
The creep said, turning towards the three kids. It was as if he knew they were there all along.
let's wreck the symbol of peace's pride.
Without warning, he made a dash towards the three students. He extended his hand towards Asui, with the intent to dissolve her from the head down. However, as his hand was only inches distance from the frog girl's face, he turned to look at the white-haired kid. The two engaged in a staring contest that seemed to take ages for both parties. The two were both clearly uncomfortable, with the pale-skinned malefactor shifting in his place.
You there, boy.
The villain said,
Where have I seen you before?
Now was Midoriya's chance. Leaping out of the water, the green-haired pyro extended his hand towards the evildoer. A ball of flame formed in his hand. As it got sufficiently hot, he fired it practically point-blank to the pasty felon. In a bittersweet turn of events, it wasn't the villain that got hit, but his mindless Frankenstein's monster. The skin of his abdomen was completely seared off, though it was only surface level. Surprised, the pale villain turned towards Midoriya as the mutant, bemused at this turn of events.
How strange.
The villain remarked,
I could have sworn one of the Nomu's quirks was regeneration.
turning towards the green-haired student, his neck making unnatural cracking sounds. He made it apparent he was placing his attention squarely on the boy.
Very impressive, child.
The lead villain said sarcastically, though it reflected a modicum of respect.
It's apparent that your fire is a lot like that number 2 hero's quirk. Are you a pupil of his?
He turned his attention back towards the frog girl. He had evidently lost interest on the topic of Izuku's fire and Zaiku's familiarity.
Well, I guess it doesn't matter.
The evildoer outstretched his arm forward, one hand reaching for the frog, the other reaching for the white-haired boy. At the same time, the Nomu grabbed Midoriya's arm. It raised its hand, preparing to strike the green-haired student as it did with Aizawa.
Your end is here.
As if on cue, the front door to the USJ blasted open. The impact of the door breaking open kicked up dust around it. Emerging from the dust was the monolith of a human. Each step echoed throughout the facility, turning everyone's attention towards the sound, even the Nomu. Have no fear, students! The symbol of peace announced, his voice reflecting that of righteous fury. I am here! As the living beacon of hope that was All Might made his stride towards the pale villain and his pet mutant, the students felt a collective wave of relief. Some released tears of joy. Others looked excited to see the number 1 preparing himself to get into action. Even Zaiku released a sigh of comfort as his body became noticeably less tense. All Might scowled, his mouth curling into that of palpable anger, though half of that was directed at himself, as he wasn't there to protect his students. The symbol of peace gripped his tie, and with a minimal effort he ripped it clean off. It was clear to all who bore witness to this practical deity that he meant business.
After all this waiting,
The villain said to himself.
the heroic piece of trash shows up.
The pale monster of a human began chuckling to himself. He was excited to test out his self-proclaimed anti-symbol of peace on the zenith paragon. The lowly minion that his ne'er-do-wells hired faltered. They had hyped themselves up far more than they knew they were capable of, as they noted the massive hero that quickly began to realize how out of their depths they were. While they argued amongst themselves as to whether or not they could strike now, All Might went into attack. In one fell swoop, the reigning champion of Japan completely disrupted the entire crowd of thugs, sending them flying towards different parts of the complex as he scooped up Aizawa in his arms. He looked down wistfully for a brief moment at his downed comrade. He knew had he been there, this could have been over and dealt with. 13 and Aizawa wouldn't have been out of commission either. As the Nomu and his master were distracted by the spectacle that was All Might, the blonde hero darted towards Midoriya, Tsuyu, and Zaiku. Scooping the trio of children up, alongside his shaggy colleague, he brought the Tetra a safe distance away from the two menaces. The force of All Might's sprint causing the hand of the main villain's face to fall off. The grayish blue-haired creep was clearly shaken up, not by the display of power he had borne witness to, jarringly enough, but by the fact that the hand on his face had fallen off. Gripping his face to obscure it, he stumbled over towards the collapsed, mummified limb, mumbling madly to himself as he did so. It was almost as if he had completely forgotten where he was and why he was there until he reattached the hand on his face. The three students lifted their teacher over their shoulders. As the trio prepared to bring Eraserhead to safety, the green-haired boy paused to tell the Paragon of Justice something.
All Might,
Midoriya said.
the villain said one of the thing's quirks is regeneration, but the area where I burnt still hasn't healed.
All Might took notice of its torso. He was too distracted by its grotesque visage that he had barely noticed the massive flesh wound on his chest. Its skin bubbled and stretched, struggling to cover itself.
Be careful, All Might. I think this guy might have a trick up his sleeve.
Shortly after taking all the necessary mental notes, he needed to take on this Nomu. He turned towards Izuku and flashed him his prize-winning smile and thumbs up. Young Midoriya! The monolithic exemplar responded. I've got this! With a nod, the three students rushed Aizawa away from the conflict. After the four had departed, the number one hero lunged forward. Crossing his arms together, he was prepared to hit the lead villain with his patented Carolina Smash. However, before he could land the hit, the Nomu stepped in the way of the hit. Its durability was unseen by practically any other villain as it tanked the attack. Though it stumbled back slightly, it remained standing, glaring at the pro the entire time.
I wasn't lying, you know. One of his quirks is regeneration, but that isn't his main quirk.
The pale villain stated.
One of his quirks is regeneration, but that isn't his main quirk.
The pitch-black mutant swung at All Might. Thankfully, due to its massive stature and its sub-idiotic intelligence, the blow had barely missed the hero.
His main quirk is shock absorption.
The Nomu met blow after blow with a mere stumble at a time. It was clear these slow, heavy hits weren't doing much to the mutant. All it did was serve to fuel the creature's mindless, homicidal rage. The two traded swings, though All Might was the only one to land any blows. Not that it mattered much, as the creature remained standing with every hit. The villain began cackling again.
It appears you finally meet your match, All Might,
the creep exclaimed haughtily.
That brat may have been able to do surface-level damage to him, but you won't even be able to do that. Not with those slow, sluggish moves of yours.
Then the wheels began turning in the number one hero's head. If he couldn't do much with strong, heavy moves, then he would have to try and bury the creature. Crouching down, the blonde hero swiveled around until he was right behind the creature. The pro then placed the mutant in a bear hug and lifted upwards, aiming to suplex the Nomu. Unfortunately, before the wrestling move could land, the evil miasma opened a warp gate from under them, letting the Nomu go unscathed while it gripped onto the number one side, digging its fingers into him and actually drawing blood. The creature began dragging All Might into the vortex with him. The malevolent gas postulated slicing the pro hero in half as he was halfway through the portal. All Might, the symbol of peace, eviscerated it for an entire class full of children to see. Oh, how he reveled in the idea. Midoriya, in a desperate bid to save his idol, left Aizawa in the care of Zaiku and Tsuyu. Sprinting towards the monster holding All Might captive, he extended his hands forward, charging up a massive fiery blast for the creature as the means to weaken it for All Might. However, as he attempted to do so, the specter appeared in front of the boy, opened up another warp gate for Midoriya to stumble into. Before anything terrible could happen, however, the dusty blonde with the short fuse, Bakugo, came out of left field and detonated some of his nitroglycerin sweat point blank at the dark fog. This disrupted the warp gate means for the fiery green-haired lad. Bakugo then landed on top of the malevolent smoke metallic carapace, pinning him down. At the same time, Shoto began freezing the ground beneath him, the ice leading towards the Nomu, freezing its right side. This weakened the beast enough for the Paragon of Justice to wrench himself out of its grip. The lead villain decided he had just about enough with these meddling kids. First, he commanded the Nomu to stand up from the warp gate. The ice caused half of its body to crumble, though that wasn't anything the Nomu couldn't regenerate, even if it still had trouble regenerating the wound on its torso. Second, the raspy-voiced malefactor commanded the Nomu to attack Bakugo and free his smoky comrade. The mutant did this without question, barreling towards the blonde-haired boy at full speed. All Might had no choice but to take the hit for him. The blow sent the symbol of peace careening towards a wall. While the blow certainly winded All Might for a second, the hero was still on his 2 feet. After hearing the villain's shoddy, not to mention phony excuse for committing acts of wanton violence, All Might decided neither he nor his students would suffer this no more. Both he and the creature would make a mad dash towards each other and trade blows, the force of which began blowing both the students and the villains away from each other. It was clear to them this was All Might's and the Nomu's battle. The pace at which All Might began delivering blows began to heighten. Each fist began contacting the raw flesh on the Nomu at a faster and faster pace. Before long, the Nomu wouldn't be able to swing at All Might in the slightest. The force of All Might's punches just became too great for this beast. All Might already had the creature in the air, keeping it afloat with the speed of his punches. It was like he was juggling the creature with each strike. The mutant couldn't do much at this point. It screeched in impotent rage at its opponent, frustrating that it couldn't deal one hit. Not once did its strikes connect with the number one hero. Finally, the pro capped it off with his trademark Texas Smash. Combined with the force of the blow, plus the fact that each hit had connected with the still regenerating flesh on its torso, the creature's stomach and chest imploded on itself as it was sent flying away from the complex, away from the students, and away from the villains that had it under its control. All Might then turned towards the villain and offered an ultimatum of surrender. It wasn't like this criminal could do anything to the symbol of peace.
He cheated.
The villain hissed in childish rage.
He cheated.
The villain hissed in childish rage. The pasty ne'er-do-well couldn't believe his eyes. This was the pinnacle of bioengineering, the very thing to rival All Might's sheer strength. There was no other explanation in the petulant malefactor's head. All Might had to have cheated. The villain began scratching himself incessantly. It was abundantly clear he had no plan for a loss. He had banked on Nomu's immediate success, and was completely blindsided when All Might made short work of the mutant. Rambling and muttering to himself, he had no idea whether to attack now in a fit of fury or flee before he faced the consequences. "What's wrong?" All Might's face boomed. It was the only thing to stop the cadaverous man from scratching himself. "Not attacking me?" Didn't you say you were going to clear this level early? The number 1 hero taunted. Well, come and get me, if you dare! The challenge alone caused the lead villain to stumble back. He wasn't prepared to fight All Might. Not without Nomu, and certainly not one-on-one. This sight was enough to both impress and comfort Bakugo and Shoto. However, something felt off to Midoriya, who had his eyes peeled on his idol. If All Might could, he would have made quick work of the villain and his smoky cohort. But he wasn't moving. He was just standing there. But why? It wasn't enough to cause any worry for the young green-haired boy at the moment, though. However, as he began regrouping with the other students, he overheard the malicious Mist speak to his boss. Tomoro Shigaraki, please do not fret. The Spectre said to his boss. So that was his name, Tomoro Shigaraki. Look at him. He was definitely weakened. Izuku spun around to face them. It made sense now as to why All Might was moving to deliver the finishing blow. He couldn't. He spent far too much stamina on the mutant, and combined with his injuries, it was clear he was only bluffing to get them to back off. The green-haired student's anxiety came to the forefront. At the same time, Shigaraki's anxiety began to waver. It slowly began getting replaced with newfound confidence. His misty companion seemed to know just the right thing to say to calm his nerves. It didn't help that at the same time, their lowly minions slowly began to recover. Even with the loss of Nomu, things had begun looking up for Shigaraki and his army. If you and I work together, we can do this, the smoky villain said to his superior. We haven't missed our chance to kill All Might. With those words, Shigaraki dropped his hands to his side. No longer was he scratching his neck in impotent rage. He was actually calm.
Yeah.
The pasty criminal muttered.
Yeah, you're right.
The petulant villain became resolute. The timing couldn't be more beneficial for the League of Villains.
This is it. We have no choice.
Shigaraki growled.
We have to do this now.
The pale villain's eyes narrowed in concentration. He was willing to risk everything on this next move. At the same time, his cronies had all but recovered. Each of the formerly downed delinquents were back on their feet, and just as pumped as ever. Bakugo and Shoto averted their attention from the two main villains, and focused on the ones mere feet from them.
Come on, Deku,
Shoto demanded, albeit impassively. Help us fight these delinquents. There was no answer from the green-haired boy. He was zoned in on All Might standing off against Shigaraki. It was like he was watching a cowboy and an outlaw having their last stand in a spaghetti western film. The area around them was dense. The atmosphere thickened so much it became almost palpable. Without warning, the pale criminals began sprinting at the number 1 hero, and even still, All Might didn't move. It was clear Midoriya had to do something. Sprinting forward, the fury green-haired lad jumped upwards and began propelling himself through the air using his fire quirk.
What?
Shoto choked out.
God damn it, Izuku!
Though Midoriya heard his adoptive brother's annoyance, it was too late. He was already mid-air and barreling towards the black mist. If he could just direct his fire towards the metal apparatus, it would surely put the criminal out of commission. Unfortunately, the villain had grown wise to that trick. Noticing the young boy flying towards him, he opened up a warp gate to his side. At the same time, Shigaraki pushed his hand through the portal. It was reaching for Midoriya's face. It was at this moment the green-haired boy realized his error in rushing head-on. Cackling filled the boy's ears as the cadaverous malefactor's hand inched closer and closer towards him. He knew exactly what getting grabbed entailed, but he was too close to turn away or drop downwards. There was nothing Izuku could do. No escape from this. He was certain this was the end of him. That would be, of course, had a bullet not pierced Shigaraki's hand. A loud bang, followed by the lead villain's hand blowing open, would save the green-haired boy from an untimely demise. Following this, Shigaraki quickly pulled his hand back through his end of the warp gate and leapt backwards. They arrived! All Might said in relief. Pouring in through the gate were the pro-heroes that worked for UA. Among them were Midnight, Gunhead, President Mike, and Principal Nezu, as well as a great many others. In that group was class representative Tenya Ida as well. He returned to help his fellow classmates alongside the pros. In an act of desperation, the 2-bit thugs began rushing up the stairs to attack the UA High teachers. This was met by an uncharacteristically deep pan. President Mike stepped up to the front. As the villains began making a mad dash up the stairs, the heroic DJ took in a deep breath.
Yeah!
President Mike screeched. The sheer volume of his voice, thanks to his quirk, effortlessly sent the horde of delinquents flying from them. Those that didn't fly away from them were surely deafened. Up next was the pro-hero, Ectoplasm. Opening his jagged mouth, a thick, viscous goo began shooting out. Before long, the slime formed into a legion of clones. The duplicates of Ectoplasm flew towards the various ne'er-do-wells and made quick work of the ones that weren't dispatched due to President Mike's quirk. It was too late for the villains. The pros had already shown up. He couldn't do the one thing he went to the USJ to do, nor could he kill any of the students. He had failed. The black mist opened up a warp gate. It was time for the two to go home. Before they did, Shigaraki had one last thing to say.
I may have failed to kill you this time, All Might.
The villain hissed.
But your days are numbered, All Might. Symbol of peace. I'm going to kill you.
And with that, Shigaraki and his cohort had vanished. Not a trace of either of them remained. As the villain and his cohort had vanished into thin air, the students were left dumbfounded and stunned. Even the likes of Bakugo, Shoto, and Zaiku were left in complete awe. It was on that day that the students realized what the pros protect them from every day. It was a revelation they weren't prepared for, but they nonetheless learned it. The class of 1A could do nothing but stand in veneration as the heroes cleaned up the unconscious bodies of the thugs that laid before them. It wouldn't be long before they woke up, so they'd need to be restrained as soon as they were able. Thoughts raced through the school children's heads. Some were of relief, while others were of dread. What if All Might hadn't showed up when he did? What if the pros hadn't either? It was the collective combination of reassurance and disquietude that kept the children stiff in their tracks. Young Midoriya laid on the ground, adjacent to his idol. He turned his head towards All Might. Was he okay? Did he accidentally sing him with his fire? The next thing the Viridine-haired boy would see would petrify him far more than anything today had. What stood before him was a half-muscular, half-emaciated man. One part of his hair was that of All Might he knew, but the other was raggedy. Midoriya went pale at this sight. Did that Shigaraki guy get his hands on All Might after all? No, it was apparent Tomura's quirk turned people into dust. It didn't shrivel them up. And Midoriya knew enough about fire to know that it didn't wilt people like that either. However, before Izuku could even get a peep out, All Might placed a finger upon his own mouth.
Shh! Keep it down.
The number one hero exclaimed in hushed urgency. This was disconcerting to the young boy. He had never seen All Might in a level of vulnerability, and yet there he was, cadaverous and desperate. This shook the poor boy to his core. With an exhale, the number one lowered his head in shame. Are you done laying on the ground, Deku? Shoto asked sardonically. Midoriya was conflicted. What had happened to All Might?
We can talk about this later, young Midoriya. Please just go back with your friends.
All Might pleaded. It was apparent the shriveled number one didn't want the confused green-haired boy to tell anyone. Slowly getting up to his feet, Midoriya gave All Might a long, hard look. How did he get like this? He was a proud obelisk of a man not a few minutes ago, yet here he was now, half of his body completely atrophied. Midoriya then made his way back to Bakugo and Shoto, to which he was met with a stern rap on the head by his adoptive brother.
You idiot!
Shoto hissed.
What you did was seriously reckless. What would have I told father if he had gotten killed?
Given Shoto's track record with the green-haired boy, Midoriya had no clue if he was genuinely worried or simply taking frustration out on him. Nonetheless, he did raise a good point. Endeavour had been nothing but kind to Midoriya, which was evidently strange and uncharacteristic considering his seeming lack of regard for his other children. In any case, Izuku was still hung up on the vestige of All Might's shriveled body. It was like something out of a fever dream to the boy. As the students made their way outside, the police began to arrive and arrest the thugs that had been taken out by the pro-heroes. One of the detectives took account of the students of 1A. Everyone had appeared to be uninjured. As the students were getting ready to board the bus, Bakugo stepped up behind Midoriya.
Hey, Deku. No, Midoriya.
The yellow-haired delinquent sounded softer than he usually did. This was enough to get his Fury classmates' attention alone.
Look, I didn't mean what I said to spread around.
As far as I know, someone was eavesdropping, or that Uraraka broad couldn't keep her damn mouth shut.
A silence befell the two students. It was a lot to take in for Midoriya. He was clearly taken aback by Katsuki's vaguely remorseful tone of voice.
Look, that's my apology. Take it if you want. Don't if you don't. I don't really care.
The explosive lad then began to shove Midoriya out of the way as he cut in line for the bus, attempting to escape what he had perceived to be an awkward situation.
Wait, Kachan!
Midoriya called out to Bakugo. This sense of informality was enough to catch his attention this time. He slightly turned his head to face his once meek childhood rival.
You know, Deku's just fine.
Bakugo stood there, staring at Midoriya for a bit. After what seemed like forever to both of them, the delinquent released a scoff along with a small smirk.
Damn nerd,
Bakugo said in response before boarding the bus. Though the pair of kids couldn't explain why, they felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from their chests. Meanwhile, however, evil was still brewing. In the slums of Mustafu, Kurogiri and Shigaraki materialized inside a derelict bar. The pasty criminal strew about on the floor, staining the floorboards with his crimson liquid. However, the only thing to overshadow the pain of being shot in both arms and legs was the rage of his defeat. This was his first battle, and he lost outright. It was biting and infuriating to Tomura. However, there was one thing that made Shigaraki angrier than anything else.
The symbol of peace wasn't Wiccan at all. You were wrong, Master. So wrong.
As the pale villain screamed his lament, he looked up at the TV screen. Displayed were bright purple letters that read, "Sound only."
No, I wasn't. We just weren't as prepared as we should have been.
The voice from the television screen said. Another more elderly voice responded in agreement, stating his gratitude in losing under their alias, League of Villains, and not their own. However, they both expressed confusion over the absence of Nomo and asked about his whereabouts.
He was blown away,
The viscous miasma said in response.
It was All Might's doing. Without coordinates to his precise location, I could not use my warp to bring him with us.
The more elderly voice responded in exasperation and disbelief. He was clearly distraught over the effort they put in to make him as strong as All Might. Though Shigaraki's master responded in mere inconvenience. Shigaraki expressed rage, however, specifically at the fiery green-haired boy that got in his way of killing All Might. Shigaraki's faceless master, however, only had reassuring words for his underling. That next time, Shigaraki will show the world why it should fear him. Thank you all for indulging yourselves in the story thus far. I hope you enjoyed it. Now there are a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. Firstly, we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes deep into the facts and lore of a wide variety of anime. It's sure to expand your weeb knowledge for all kinds of series, guaranteed. On top of that, we have a third channel called We Celestial Naruto What Ifs. It's what we do on this channel already, but in the vast world and lore of Naruto. Go check it out if you're in the mood for some jutsu action. Secondly, on behalf of We Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. Lastly, if you're interested in what we do here at We Celestial, then I would like to extend out an invitation to join the team. The only caveat being, we only accept members 16 years and up to join our crew. You can sign up for whichever category fulfills your interests by joining the recruitment Discord using the link in the description below. Our Discord is an all-around fantastic place to be, whether you're a fan or looking to join our band of misfits. We're always looking for members to join us. Well, that's it from us for today's video, so thank you all for watching and have a great day.